Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. 2025 has gotten underway, and with it, here's my first weekend box office roundup video to begin the year. And for the weekend that ended on January 5th, 2025, no new movies were part of this weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office. Instead, this weekend had the same 5 movies that were the top 5 for 2024's final weekend at the box office, except that 4 of those movies shifted positions. And the cumulative total earnings for this weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office fell to $80.8 million, which was a 39.73% decrease from last weekend's cumulative total of $134.1 million. So this was the first weekend in 3 weeks since the top 5's cumulative domestic box office total was below $100 million. But before proceeding, if you're enjoying this video, please consider pressing the like button, and if you'd like to see more of my content, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel. And I want to convey my deepest thanks and appreciation to everyone who has subscribed. This weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office included the following. Rising to number 1 for the very first time since it opened 2 weeks ago was Walt Disney Pictures' animated prequel entitled Mufasa the Lion King. Falling to number 2 for the first time since it opened 2 weeks ago was Paramount Pictures, Sega Sammy Group's Original Films, Marsa Animation Planets, and Blur Studios' animated threequel entitled Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Clinging to number 3 was Studio 8's Focus Features, Maiden Voyage Films, and Birch Hill Road Entertainment's horror movie entitled Nosferatu. Rising to number 4 was Walt Disney Animation Studios' sequel entitled Moana 2. And falling to number 5 was Universal Pictures and Mark Platt Productions' musical fantasy entitled Wicked, starring Cynthia Erivo, Ariana Grande, Jeff Goldblum, and Michelle Yeoh. Domestically, Mufasa the Lion King earned another $23.8 million during the weekend and $31.6 million during the week, and it earned another $93.3 million internationally and $148.7 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $168.6 million, $307.8 million, and $476.4 million respectively. Domestically, Sonic the Hedgehog 3 earned another $21.2 million during the weekend and $29.7 million during the week, and it earned another $74.8 million internationally and $125.7 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $187.5 million, $148.8 million, and $336.3 million respectively. Domestically, Nosferatu earned another $13.2 million, and it earned another $28 million internationally and $57.1 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $69.4 million, $31 million, and $100.4 million respectively. Domestically, Moana 2 earned another $12.4 million during the weekend and $17.4 million during the week, and it earned another $47.4 million internationally and $77.2 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $425.2 million, $535.3 million, and $960.5 million respectively. So, Moana 2 will more than likely become the third highest grossing movie worldwide for 2024 by next weekend. Domestically, Wicked earned another $10.2 million during the weekend and $16 million during the week, and it earned another $20.4 million internationally and $46.6 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $450.8 million, $230.5 million, and $681.3 million respectively. I'd love to know in the comments below whether you watched any of these 5 movies this weekend and what you thought about them if you did, or whether you weren't interested in seeing any of them. So as of this first weekend of 2025, we're continuing to deal with the 3 highest-grossing movies domestically for 2024. And those 3 movies remained Disney Pixar's animated movie Inside Out 2, Disney and Marvel Studios' MCU movie Deadpool and Wolverine, and Universal's Wicked, with domestic box office earnings of $653 million, $636.7 million, and $450.8 million, respectively. So Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine remain the only 2 movies so far for 2024 that have broken $600 million domestically, and Deadpool and Wolverine became the highest-grossing R-rated movie of all time domestically. And globally, the 3 highest-grossing movies for 2024 remain Inside Out 2, Deadpool and Wolverine, and Illumination Entertainment's animated sequel Despicable Me 4, with earnings of $1,698.6 million, $1,338.1 million, and $969.2 million, respectively. Though Moana 2 is currently poised to outperform Despicable Me 4 and become the 3rd highest-grossing movie globally of 2024. Inside Out 2 outperformed last year's highest-grossing movie Barbie by $253 million, and Deadpool and Wolverine became both the highest-grossing R-rated movie worldwide of all time and the MCU's 6th highest-grossing movie worldwide of all time. Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine remain the only 2 movies that have broken $1 billion worldwide for 2024, and Despicable Me 4 is only the 3rd movie so far for 2024 that has broken $900 million worldwide, but Moana 2 has now become the 4th movie to break $900 million worldwide as of this weekend. The reported production budgets for Inside Out 2, Deadpool and Wolverine, and Despicable Me 4 are $200 million, $250 million, and $100 million, respectively. And to estimate what their break-even point ranges might be, I'll multiply each movie's production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. And when I do that, we get the following estimated break-even point ranges. For Inside Out 2, we get an estimated break-even point range of $500 million to $600 million. For Deadpool and Wolverine, we get an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. And for Despicable Me 4, we get an estimated break-even point range of $250 million to $300 million. Thus, all 3 of these movies have made bank. That brings us to several other movies that I am continuing to track but are no longer in or never were in the top 5, and they include the following. Clinging to number 8 was Paramount Pictures' Scott Free Films' Lucy Fisher's and Douglas Wick's historical drama Gladiator 2, starring Paul Mescal, Denzel Washington, and Pedro Pascal. Clinging to number 11 was Columbia Pictures, Sony Pictures, Marvel Entertainment's, and 2 other studios' supervillain movie entitled Kraven the Hunter. And finally, falling to number 26 was Universal Pictures and DreamWorks Animation's movie entitled The Wild Robot. Domestically, Gladiator 2 earned another $2.7 million during the weekend and $3.1 million during the week, and it earned another $8.7 million internationally and $14.5 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $168.9 million, $280.8 million, and $449.7 million, respectively. Domestically, Kraven the Hunter earned another $1.1 million during the weekend and $1.3 million during the week, and it earned another $3.8 million internationally and $6.2 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $23.7 million, $35 million, and $58.7 million, respectively. Domestically, The Wild Robot earned another $27,000, which wasn't enough to raise its current domestic box office total over $143.2 million. And since the movie had no new international box office earnings, both its international and global gross box office totals remained unchanged at $181.1 million and $324.3 million, respectively. Now, to know whether these movies are going to break even or not, as well as how much money they might be losing, we need to estimate their break-even points. When a movie's marketing budget is known, we can add it to the movie's production budget and then multiply the sum by 2. Otherwise, we can multiply the production budget by 2.5 for a single mid-range estimated break-even point, or by both 2.5 and 3.0 for a broader estimated break-even point range. Both methods account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves. For Mufasa the Lion King, with its production budget of $200 million, as reported by multiple sources, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $500 million to $600 million. For Sonic the Hedgehog 3, with its production budget of around $122 million, as reported by the New York Times, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $305 million to $366 million. Since Wicked and Moana 2 have identical reported production budgets of $150 million, each of them has an estimated break-even point range of $375 million to $450 million. For Gladiator 2, with its reported very high production budget of $250 million, as reported by Variety, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. For Kraven the Hunter, with its reported production budget of $110 million, according to Variety, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $275 million to $330 million. For The Wild Robot, with its production budget of $78 million, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $195 million to $234 million. So in this video, I am no longer projecting or never have projected what the final domestic or global gross box office earnings might be for the movies Gladiator 2 or The Wild Robot, because their expected future earnings are either currently too small, possibly non-existent, or going unreported, or their projected earnings aren't much higher than their current earnings. For Gladiator 2, with its reported global gross box office earnings of $449.7 million and its estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million, the movie currently stands to lose somewhere on the order of $173.3 million to $300.3 million in global gross box office revenue. But The Wild Robot has already made bank. Then, by dividing the losses in global gross box office revenue by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, the affected studios currently stand to lose the following. For Gladiator 2, Paramount Pictures, Scott-Free Films, Lucy Fisher, and Douglas Wick currently stand to lose around $87.7 million to $150.2 million. And that now brings us to the movies whose final domestic and global gross box office revenues I am currently projecting, which includes Mufasa the Lion King, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Moana 2, Wicked, and Kraven the Hunter. For Mufasa the Lion King, using a range of possible average weekly drops from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $251.7 million at the low end, $271.4 million at the mid-range, and $297.3 million at the upper end, which is higher than last week's projection. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 35.39%, which is higher than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $711.2 million at the low end, $766.7 million at the mid-range, and $840 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection. So with the movie's estimated break-even point range of $500 million to $600 million, Mufasa the Lion King should marginally break even by next weekend, and it should fully break even in 2 weeks. For Sonic the Hedgehog 3, using a range of possible average weekly drops from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $263.9 million at the low end, $282 million at the mid-range, and $305.8 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 55.75%, which is much lower than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $473.3 million at the low end, $505.7 million at the mid-range, and $548.5 million at the upper end, which is higher than last week's projection. And with the movie's estimated break-even point range of $305 million to $366 million, the movie marginally broke even as of this weekend, and it should fully break even by next weekend. For Moana 2, using a range of possible average weekly drops from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $469.8 million at the low end, $480.3 million at the mid-range, and $493.8 million at the upper end, which is higher than last week's projection. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 44.27%, which is nearly the same as last week's, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $1,061.4 million at the low end, $1,085 million at the mid-range, and $1,115.6 million at the upper end, which is higher than last week's projection. Moana 2 should break $1 billion at the worldwide box office by next weekend, which will make it only the third movie to have done so for 2024, so the movie will also most definitely surpass the worldwide box office earnings of Despicable Me 4 by next weekend, which will make it the third highest grossing movie worldwide for 2024. And yes, Moana 2 has already made bank. For Wicked, using a range of possible average weekly drops from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $489.9 million at the low end, $499 million at the mid-range, and $510.7 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection, and continues to be far more likely to remain the third highest grossing movie domestically for 2024, ahead of Moana 2. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 66.16%, which is slightly lower than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $740.5 million at the low end, $754.2 million at the mid-range, and $771.9 million at the upper end, which is barely higher than last week's projection. So while Wicked continues to outperform Moana 2 domestically, it still won't be able to catch up to Moana 2's global gross box office earnings because Moana 2 is outperforming Wicked internationally, as illustrated by Wicked's domestic share being around 20% higher than Moana 2's. But Wicked has already made bank. For Kraven the Hunter, this is Sony's and Columbia Pictures' 18th Marvel movie, which began with their 1997 Marvel movie entitled Men in Black. Using the first 17 movies' combined average weekly drop of 34.32% with a standard deviation of 9.48%, that creates a range of possible average weekly drops for this movie from 24.84% to 43.80%. And using that range, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $26.8 million at the low end, $28.3 million at the mid-range, and $30.8 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection, which further proves that Kraven the Hunter is going to become the lowest grossing Sony Marvel movie domestically of all time by replacing Madam Web and its $43.8 million in final domestic box office revenue. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 40.37%, which is lower than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $66.3 million at the low end, $70 million at the mid-range, and $76.2 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection, and further proves that Kraven the Hunter is going to become the lowest grossing Sony Marvel movie worldwide of all time by replacing Madam Web and its $100.3 million in final global gross box office revenue. And with the movie's estimated break-even point range of $275 million to $330 million, Kraven the Hunter is a bona fide flop as it currently stands to lose somewhere on the order of $198.8 million to $263.7 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, means that Columbia Pictures, Sony Pictures, Marvel Entertainment, and 2 other studios currently stand to lose around $99.4 million to $131.9 million. So to recap, Kraven the Hunter and Gladiator 2 are definite flops, but The Wild Robot, Deadpool and Wolverine, Inside Out 2, Despicable Me 4, Moana 2, and Wicked have all made bank, while Sonic the Hedgehog 3 has marginally broken even, and Mufasa the Lion King should marginally break even by next week. Please let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video and whether you have or are planning to see any of the movies that I talked about. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to each and every one of you who has subscribed to support this channel. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, and Blue Sky by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.